Good morning. Uh, our Sunday school lesson today we're going to call a remarkable Sunday stroll. Uh, it's remarkable in a lot of ways, but primarily because it concerns a man who had been crippled for over 38 years. Well, uh, we'll look at John, the 5th chapter, for our lesson. You know, many of us during the time of our childhood probably had some favorite getaway place where our families would go on a Sunday afternoon, maybe a scenic picnic spot or one of the lakes at a nearby state park, or just the big swimming hole on Hurricane Creek, which was located just down the hill from our house. There, carloads of people from all over the community would make their way to the parking area at the old corn mill, duck under the strands of the barbed wire fence of our pasture, and follow the trail beside the creek to Big Rock, our swimming hole. My wife grew up in Boiling Springs, and their getaway place was Rainbow Lake. Every weekend in the summer months, families gathered at the lake for the Saturday night parties or the Sunday afternoon picnics and the opportunity to swim in the cold, clear water of the lake. In those days, there were almost no private pools, hot tubs, or saunas. There was only the creeks and the rivers and a few area lakes. You may also recall another aspect of that time period, the issue of integration. As integration was implemented, many of the former public lakes and recreational areas began to be shut down by the local officials. Today's lesson from the 5th chapter of the book of John carries us to a major attraction where people would gather in the days of Jesus' ministry. Except that the people there weren't just gathering for fun. They were gathering in an effort to be healed or cured of various diseases. Just inside the sheep gate, which is one of the 7 gates to the city of Jerusalem, there was a pool called Bethesda. The word is written in Aramaic. It means house of mercy. The pool would normally be very still, but on occasion would begin bubbling and swirling as if it were being stirred. The science behind the activity infers that it could have been the result of a deep underground quake or spring that would erupt occasionally when the water pressure that may have been partially blocked for a while or something just broke through. But local legend insisted that the swirl was caused by an angel stirring the water and allowing the first person who entered the swirling water to be cured of illness or disease. Let's look at John, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 18. After this, there was a Jewish festival, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, in the north city wall, is a pool with the Aramaic name Bethesda. It had 5 covered porches, and a crowd of people who were sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed sat there. A certain man was there who had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there, knowing he had already been there a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" The sick man answered him, "Sir, I don't have anyone who can put me in the water when it's stirred up. When I'm trying to get to it, someone else has gotten in ahead of me." Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately, the man was well, and he picked up his mat and walked. Now that day was the Sabbath. The Jewish leaders said to the man who had been healed, It's the Sabbath. You aren't allowed to carry your mat." He answered, "The man who made me well said to me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" They inquired, "Who is this man who said to you, 'Pick it up and walk'?" The man who had been cured didn't know who it was, because Jesus had slipped away from the crowd gathered there. Later, Jesus found him in the temple and said, "See, you have been made well. Don't sin anymore in case something worse happens to you." The man went and proclaimed to the Jewish leaders that Jesus was the man who had made him well. As a result, the Jewish leaders were harassing Jesus since he had done these things on the Sabbath. Jesus replied, "My Father is still working, and I am working too." For this reason, the Jewish leaders wanted even more to kill him, not only because he was doing away with the Sabbath, but because he called God his own Father, thereby making himself equal with God. There are times when the book of John is a bit skimpy on details, and while it reveals what seems to be very personal perceptions, they're not presented as a chronology of Jesus' ministry. Some scholars think that notes or stories shared by John the Apostle became this literary, often poetic tribute. And of course, John 3:16 is probably the first Bible verse we memorized as children, and it became central in sharing God's plan of salvation for the world. When we read today's verses, we aren't told what festival Jesus is attending. We don't know why the disciples are not present, and we don't know why Jesus seemed to only address one man when a crowd of sick, blind, lame, and paralyzed people were under the cover of the 5 porches, each hoping to be first in the pool when the angels stirred the water. What we are told is that Jesus turned his attention to one specific person, a man who had been sick for 38 years. Perhaps having been sick was a phrase that did not adequately describe the man's condition, because he was crippled to the point that he could not have moved himself into the pool. But apparently, people had been assisting him to bring him close to the pool, where he lay on his mat each day. He would need a miracle just to get into the pool, another miracle to be the first one in, and another miracle to be healed. One would think that the hopelessness that he had felt for so many years would have caused him to give up, to cease efforts to even come near the pool. Maybe he had prayed for a miracle. Maybe that's why Jesus had singled him out and questioned him, "Do you want to get well?" That seems to be a very strange question. Could the man have become so accustomed to his adversity that living a healthy life without depending on others could come with doubts? Would people think that I've been faking illness all these years? Can I really get by and attempt to earn a living when I've been able to do nothing for most of my life? What if I am healthy for a short time and then face a relapse? Wouldn't that be worse than my present state? Mark Twain once said, "The only person that likes change is a wet baby." Well, and then in his poem, a famous poet wrote about a man who had been imprisoned for years, and the man had put aside all thoughts of freedom and accepted his confinement as his destiny. And he recorded the thoughts of the prisoner by saying, "My very chains and I grew friends." So when Jesus asked this man, "Do you want to be well?" he could have been asking, "Are you truly willing to assume the responsibility? that comes with good health. Or he could have been asking, do you have enough faith to make a difference in the world? We actually don't know, because the man simply voiced his frustration that he had never been able to be the first one in the pool, but he was still there, hoping for a miracle. And Jesus said, pick up your mat and walk. Perhaps the reason that John singled out this miracle of healing in his narrative was more about what happened later, as the man was reprimanded by the Pharisees for carrying his mat on the Sabbath. The Pharisees considered this to be an act of work, and they insisted that no work, even the slight task of carrying a mat, should be done on the Sabbath. Then, of course, the man had defended himself, telling the Pharisees that Jesus had healed him and had told him to sin no more. And the Pharisees were even more angry at this man named Jesus because he had healed on the Sabbath. They had shown no compassion for a man that they would have seen through the years in his crippled state. They only were concerned that he was defying their strict interpretation of the Scriptures when he carried his mat as if he were mocking them by working on the Sabbath. They then turned their anger on Jesus for prompting him to do this, and Jesus' defense incensed them to extremes. Jesus told them that the Father, his Father, continued to work each day, and that Jesus was simply following in his footsteps by doing his work. We must remember that these Pharisees were so caught up in their vision of their own power that anyone who willfully violated their laws, particularly in public, should be subject to brutal punishment. And now Jesus had not only defied them, but had blasphemed himself by claiming to be God's Son. The Pharisees wanted the people to see them as God's anointed people, and Jesus trying to erode that image. We must realize the hypocrisy of these men who had accepted deals with the Roman government to desecrate the temple grounds with merchants and money changers, as they accepted only the Roman coinage in Jerusalem, coinage with the image of the emperor imprinted on it, an emperor who proclaimed himself to be divine. The Pharisees were blinded by their personal pursuits of power and wealth, and would not tolerate having their narrow interpretations of the law being questioned, and particularly not by someone who claimed to be God's Son. The remaining verses in this chapter, verses 19 through 45, present Jesus' defensive statements. 3 different times he begins with the words, I tell you the truth. But these are people who have limited the truth to their own interpretations of God's original laws to Moses, and they neglect the fact that Moses himself wrote about the coming Messiah, the Messiah that the Pharisees were too blind to see, too unwilling to accept, and too caught up in their own sense of authority to accept his presence before them. Jesus redefined the idea of honoring the Sabbath by doing good on it. His action was motivated by compassion. He confronted what he considered to be an injustice that hurt people that needed help. He saw the day as a time for honoring wives, even if it meant adjusting rules that were inappropriate by their overly strict interpretation, even if it meant caring for others as well as for oneself, even if it means to love as Jesus loved. That's what being a Christian should be about. That's what honoring the Sabbath should be about. Of building up ourselves to show God's love and to share God's love with others. We need to work together in harmony to share that love that Jesus exemplified. Being the hands and feet of God is our responsibility. And patterning our love after that of Jesus is our opportunity as Christians. Let's pray together. Dear God, please guide us and allow us to be your church by following the example of service that Jesus displayed, and help us to share your love as we move forward in our lives. Amen.